If a person adopts Bitcoin, they're going to get wealthier than the people around them. If a business adopts Bitcoin, their stock is going to take off. If a politician gets on Bitcoin, they're going to start winning. People are going to start looking at that. They're going to be at their shareholder meetings. They're going to sit at the board. They're going to say, what are we doing? These guys are suddenly growing their balance sheet 40, 50, 60, 100% a year. Apple and Berkshire Hathaway sitting on hundreds of billions of dollars. If you then look at a 7% true inflation in your purchasing power, and you hold 300 billion of cash, that's what, $21 billion in purchasing power you're losing every year. The real game we're all playing right now is how big of a share of the 21 million coins can you capture now for yourself. Most people are going to be using Bitcoin in the future without knowing anything about it. When a nation state starts adopting Bitcoin, that's probably going to be the ultimate FOMO. While MicroStrategy has to do clever financial engineering in order to buy Bitcoin, the government could just press a button and they could push it to $1 million in a day if they wanted to.
I have one of my most favorite topics, and this is Bitcoin and businesses and the business adoption of Bitcoin. Let's just directly jump into the why. Like, why do you think Bitcoin is especially vital for businesses? And then later we can go a little bit where we are currently at the adoption phase.
100%. This is one of my favorite topics as well. It's an endless rabbit hole, and it's just a very, very important topic because I don't think Bitcoin for business is just an option or a nice thing to do. I think it's an imperative for a lot of businesses. Just the same way that Bitcoin is imperative for us as individuals to survive in this fiat inflationary world, it's the same for a business. They have all the same struggles. And I like what Michael Saylor always says, Bitcoin is the solution for every person, every organization, every family, every country. It's really the same story, but obviously for businesses, it's a bit unique. But I'd love to delve into that a little bit deeper. I don't know if there's something specific you kind of want to get at or just the business case for Bitcoin in general, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. I think businesses have, as an individual, especially if you're a young individual, you have the advantage of not having to care too much about the risks because you're only responsible for yourself. And I think that's the biggest difference to businesses where when you are, let's say, a medium-sized business with, let's say, 500 employees, I mean, that's a good size company already, but let's say 500 employees, you basically not only take the decision to put Bitcoin on your balance sheet for yourself, you kind of indirectly also take the decision for all your employees that rely on you paying their salary and stuff like that. So I think that's the biggest difference. Do you also see it that way?
That's actually a very, very good point. I mean, the value proposition is the same regardless of what kind of entity you're talking about. But the level of, let's call it perceived risk or actual risk you're taking in a corporation by putting Bitcoin on your balance sheet is definitely orders of magnitude higher. It is, I think the way I kind of think about it is as a corporate treasurer or a business owner or a CEO, a CFO, you have a responsibility, a fiduciary duty to do the best that you can for your company in managing the money, making money, whatever. And while Bitcoin certainly is new and it's risky, there's risks to everything. I think you have a responsibility to look into it and seriously think about adopting it because if you sit on the sidelines and wait, you're just going to get outcompeted by the companies that do. You're going to continually get eaten away by inflation. And so it's all about education because once you truly understand it and you manage to educate the other stakeholders in your company, your employees, and everybody's on board, we've seen this in the companies that do adopt it. It's like a fire, like a shining light that like lifts the whole company up and breathes new life into it.
Yeah, it seems kind of like a no-brainer. Like all the companies that have adopted it have amazing experiences with that. I never heard any company with a bad example of like they
No.
made extremely like all the employees wanted to quit and like nightmares like that. Like I never heard of any of that. So are you kind of satisfied with the adoption rate and growth of the corporate adoption of Bitcoin?
I'll say you always kind of want things to happen faster than they do. And it's funny, back in the spring when we had the halving, I thought I was late to the game, starting Sovereign and providing education for businesses. I thought, okay, this is about to completely go out of hand and I'm kind of late to the game. Well, 9 months later now, or whatever it is, we're still just like getting lift off from the ground on this. I think it's such a niche thing. It's, I think if you asked 1,000 business owners on the street if they're thinking about putting Bitcoin on the balance sheet, I don't think you'd get a single one of them saying that. So it is very, very new, very early.
Interesting. Yeah, it's kind of what makes me, because it's I do think it's also we are extremely early to the game, but it kind of makes me wonder, when are we not early? Like when is the point when we are no longer early? It's hard to say what has to happen. Then probably reach a saturation point of like 80-90% of the adoption, but that's far down the line.
Yeah, I think my dream scenario is that we kind of break the 4 year cycle. I don't know if it's going to happen, but that's what I would like to see, because in the previous history of Bitcoin, the last 16 years, it's been a lot of retail people, a lot of investors just seeking investment gains and being very emotional about Bitcoin. And obviously the volatility, all that, that's a feature, not a bug, but the way it can crash 70-80%, it's much easier when a bunch of crypto traders can liquidate their leveraged position on a Saturday night. But once 100,000 companies hold millions of dollars in Bitcoin and nation states hold it, I hope it's going to create some sort of buffer where we don't see these kind of drawdowns, because it would be pretty catastrophic at that point if a lot of an economy is invested in Bitcoin and it had that downturn. But the downturn is due to a lack of understanding, in my opinion. So it's very interesting. I don't know the answer to it, actually.
It's interesting. Yeah. Let's come back to the adoption curve of the corporate adoption. I feel like 2020 might be the beginning year. Obviously, before that, companies already had Bitcoin on the balance sheet. But with 2020, the first publicly traded company in America with MicroStrategy adopted Bitcoin. I feel like that's the official starting point for the corporation adoption phase. Where are we right now, and how do you look back at the last 4 years of corporate adoption?
Great question. I think the companies that went in back in 2020, if you look at them, it's really outliers and companies that already really got Bitcoin. Like, well, MicroStrategy was actually coming in from the sidelines, but you had Block, you had Tesla, these kind of companies, but it's a very, very niche thing to do. I actually subscribe to, again, Saylor's thinking that 2024 is kind of the starting point for Bitcoin's corporate adoption. I think you can make the argument both ways, but that's where it really started getting taken serious in the mainstream kind of narrative. That's when Fidelity and BlackRock and Van Eck came out with all their investment theses around Bitcoin, the spot ETFs, and now Bitcoin is just taken a. I'm curious, like for you, how it's been like the last year, 2, 3, especially coming through the bull market, the way Bitcoin has changed and the way the narrative has changed. It's very, very interesting to me, and I hope it's just going to keep going like that, and we get this legitimate information spread instead of all this dumb FUD or whatever you want to say.
I think a lot has changed actually last year.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's because of the price, if it's because the ETFs with BlackRock are here now, or more like even Trump is now in the game. So it feels like it gets harder and harder to get funding for Bitcoin, against Bitcoin campaigns, to get the word out against Bitcoin, just because the side of for Bitcoin, the pro Bitcoin side is getting stronger and stronger. And therefore the data, the proof that what Bitcoin actually does, gets better and better. And it just gets harder and harder to have that FUD going on, which is a really good sign. We still have a lot of mainstream I don't know where you're at home, but in Austria, we have mainstream media. When Bitcoin comes into the media, it's either because it shoots up crazy or it crashes down crazy. That's the only times when they are reporting on it.
I mean, I'll definitely say the average mainstream opinion on Bitcoin is very uninformed, and I just feel like there's not this kind of venom in people's words. There's not this kind of hatred towards it that there was just a couple years ago. Every time it was mentioned, it's so bad, it's all these criminals, and it's bad for the environment, and it's horrible. Now, when I see people on CNBC, especially in the US, I'm from Denmark, but I don't really follow the media here. I think it's very positive, and I think some of the news anchors are actually supporting Bitcoin. And we've seen these funny clips where somebody will come on, sit there talking, saying all sorts of nonsense about Bitcoin, and then actually being corrected. Bitcoin is actually, not only is it not bad for the environment, it's actually our most powerful lever against climate change. It is actually really good for the environment. It actually is the best performing asset. The volatility is a feature, not a bug. I mean, you could go on and on and on, but this is changing now, and I'm actually seeing this being said by more mainstream sources, and that it's not just a bunch of Bitcoiners yelling on Twitter. Now it's actually the big fish that are starting to get on the narrative, and I think that has a tremendous impact on the narrative in general.
It's interesting. A lot of OG Bitcoiners and a lot of hardcore Bitcoin maxes even think that might be a bad thing, that those big institutions and the big corporations are now kind of entering the game and as you said, changing the narrative. Do you see it as a potential bad thing for Bitcoin, that the narrative is changing? Or maybe one step before that, how do you see the narrative changing right now?
Such a good question. I think some people might be a little bit overzealous in their desire to keep Bitcoin kind of cypherpunk, or keep it underground, or keep it for the individual. And I respect that a lot. I honestly have a lot of respect for people that really want to keep the integrity and the values of Bitcoin intact. But I think we have to acknowledge that we don't want Bitcoin to be a $2 trillion asset forever and just be a thing that we kind of use for this and that and whatever. It's like a niche thing. We want the world to become hyper Bitcoinization. And I'm only speaking for myself, but I would love to see a world where Bitcoin is everywhere and not just on Twitter. In order to get there, we must get people on board. We cannot say, oh, BlackRock cannot be in this, the government can't buy it. It is a huge risk. It is the risk of capture by these people that we know I would not put it behind them to try to take over Bitcoin in some way, but it's a risk we have to take if we want it to go mainstream, if we want it to go to its natural end. I think, in my opinion, we need the support of the establishment. What else can we do? I mean, there's no other option, in my opinion.
Absolutely, yeah. It's just like if you want Bitcoin to grow, of course companies will buy it. Of course nation states will buy it. Of course your enemies will buy Bitcoin.
Yeah.
And it's that the narrative of Bitcoin is for everyone might be hard to swallow for some people.
Yeah. Well, I understand it because it there is a risk of growing too fast. That's what I would say would be the risk if it went too fast and there suddenly was a gigantic amount of Bitcoin just custodied one place, for example, with Coinbase, and suddenly the US government and everybody's in it. Beginnings are delicate times, and Bitcoin is still in its infancy. I mean, if there's $900 trillion of assets and we're at a little bit over 2 trillion or something last I checked, there is a risk of it just happening too fast and we're not ready for it. But I'm happy to see this. I would rather have everybody, BlackRock getting in now, pumping it up, and we can disperse this knowledge to the world than sitting around for another 5-10 years just talking on Bitcoin Twitter about, this and that. So
we need. I think Bitcoin is an asset. Either it grows or it dies off. Like
yes,
it has to kind of become bigger and bigger and come to a substantial size in our, because it's a network effect game. It's similar to a social media. If you're not coming to a substantial size of users, at some point people will stop using it because nobody else is using it. So there's some network effects around that. But it's really interesting that you mentioned the risk of growing too fast. It's kind of like what would trigger Bitcoin to grow too fast? It's kind of like will the fiat system die too fast? And I think that's the real risk there, where we don't want the Titanic to sink too quick.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we might not come soon enough with the life rafts there, and people will die in the ocean.
Very well said. I think the term maximum velocity is important because I think if you look at Bitcoin's history, it has grown as fast as it possibly can. And when you think about Bitcoin's volatility, I don't know who it was that described this recently, but it made a lot of sense to me. If Bitcoin was just constantly going up in some linear, predictable fashion, then people would pile into it, which is what happens. Then it would not be linear. It would keep going further and further up. And then obviously, then you get all the speculation. Then you have people shorting it. It would crash. And that's exactly what we have. That's what Bitcoin is. It's these cycles of fueled demand and then the fear and the greed. So it couldn't, I don't think there's a scenario where Bitcoin goes from $0 to $10 million in 5 years. There's just no way. It cannot grow that fast. The wings are going to get ripped off the plane. And if I can say one more thing to it, I think it's important to be honest about the fact that, this is my opinion, but governments are not on our side when it comes to money and when it comes to this sort of stuff. I think the way money has been captured by governments and used for financial repression and their own financial gain and the whole central banking rabbit hole, I think once Bitcoin starts really succeeding, they're going to say the fiat system is collapsing because of Bitcoin. It's not going to be seen as the solution. They're going to, Janet Yellen or whoever is the talking head at that time is going to come out and say, our financial institutions are being threatened by Bitcoin. The financial system, our security, our national security is being threatened. We have to do something. And that's when something happens. I don't want to get into specifics, but that's when you could think about the capture happening. Yeah, I don't know what you think about that. It's a very sensitive topic for a lot of people, this.
Yeah, it's interesting because I was talking 1 or 2 days ago with a guest of mine on the podcast, where we talked about money printing is kind of like an addict. If there are those studies with rats with addictions, with like they press a button, they get a dopamine hit, and then they study how the rat behaves in different situations. So obviously it will hit that button as much as possible and to the extent that it eventually will die. interesting enough, if you take the button away, so not the button away, but the control of the button away, so you can still press it, but there's no dopamine hit, they will really fast stop pressing that button.
Right.
And then there's another thing. If they have some catastrophic event and the button is not working, they still will go to the button, even though they know it's not working, just in the frustration of let's try to press it. Let's see, maybe all of a sudden it works again. If we now lay that on the financial system, I don't know how much we can lay that on there, but for me, money printing is an addiction of the central banks and the banking and the government institutions. And if we're now having kind of a solution and people leaving that fiat system and flooding to Bitcoin, and the more they inflate it, the more they press that money printer, the more they come to Bitcoin. And that's kind of their problem. They always want to solve everything with the money printer, and they make everything worse, and then they lead everyone to the Bitcoin.
Yes, exactly. And I think the big question is, are they going to admit and say, listen, we actually caused all these problems. The business cycle and the debt is actually fueled by governments overspending and money printing. I don't think in a million years anybody's going to admit that. I think they're going to find a scapegoat. They're like they always do. I mean, it's human nature, and they're going. Let me come about this a little bit differently. I just had thoughts. If the world transitions to a Bitcoin standard, the way our financial system and our economies work right now are completely incompatible with that kind of a world. It's a deflationary world based on sound money and not a debt-based system like we have now. So if we think about the financial crisis in 2008, it was just papered over and just quantitative easing, and in my opinion, that is just fraud. It's just like basically like you had a company that's going under and then you just printed money to just keep it alive, like that's what it is, zombie economy. And if you removed all the assets from the Fed's balance sheet, the economy would collapse. So, well, in my opinion, so let's say we switch over more and more over to Bitcoin. Those $36 trillion of debt that is being sustained by money printing and more debt could not exist because you can't print Bitcoin. So that whole system would have to unravel. And as it's unraveling and people are scared, losing their jobs, losing money, losing positions in government or whatever, they're going to point their finger at whatever they can. And obviously Bitcoin, since it's driving that, they're going to say, look, Bitcoin is bad for you. We need to do this for national security or whatever, hypothetically.
Interesting. It's also, that is an interesting question. What do you think an addict to drugs does when you take away his drug? And that's, I think, the same question we have to ask ourselves for central banks. What happens if all those elites that are in control all of a sudden see that their favorite drug, money printing, is no longer there? What will they do? What does a drug addict do if you take away his drug?
Yeah, well, they're definitely going to go kicking and screaming. They're not just going to roll over, that's for sure. And that's going to be a big mess. I'm not looking forward to that one bit.
Interesting. Yeah, it's like they want to hold on to it, and they will do anything in their power to hold on to it. It's really interesting to think about what they could do. But at the same time, Bitcoin grows in power, and therefore also politicians slowly, and we see that trend already, switch to the Bitcoin side. We even see banks, regional banks, switching to the Bitcoin side. I don't know if you know about the German bank Volksbank. They are offering Bitcoin to buy. They are having Bitcoin education. They are Bitcoin, not crypto. Really interesting.
Wow, I did not know that. That's fantastic.
They're amazing. They even have like events for Bitcoin with like 1,000 participants. People there, and they're really on Bitcoin. I'm amazed how good of a job they're doing, and so we see kind of already in the infancy of Bitcoin, politicians company leaders and banks already switching to the Bitcoin side, and that's kind of the hope that I have for a peaceful revolution. But at the same time, I have that there are those huge central banks who have a lot of resources,
Yes.
and we take away their favorite toy.
We take away their reason for existing. The reason for a central bank to exist is to manage the money supply and do all this financial engineering in the economy. And Bitcoin basically you're just outsourcing all of that effort to Bitcoin, and it just runs it through mathematics and computer science and whatnot. It is very interesting what you're saying, because it's not just going to be Bitcoiners versus the establishment. What we're seeing is that when people jump on the Bitcoin train, if a person adopts Bitcoin, they're going to get wealthier than the people around them. If a business adopts Bitcoin, their stock is going to take off. If a politician or institution or some kind of organization gets on Bitcoin, they're going to start winning. But I think there's always going to be another side that is getting that Bitcoin derangement syndrome. They're going to be mad. They're going to be so upset, and they're not going to capitulate into Bitcoin. They're just going to be kicking and screaming, and it's going to be this fight between the people that have sound money and the people that are stuck on the ship, the Titanic going down.
The one thing here that we have to also think about is the people that have sound money will benefit a lot over time from that. Their resources will get better. Their life, because of the resources getting better, will also get better. So their life will get better. And if you are stuck on that ship, you're kind of hopeless. And with Bitcoin, you have hope. And so my hope is just like that people see that. But maybe I'm naive. Maybe I'm too young and naive for that. I believe in the good in people, and I'm really optimistic about the future. But yeah, I just hope that we can see that. But then again, I was at Christmas Eve on the family table, and there's my close family who all get Bitcoin. But then there's the wide family. I have a really big family with people that, I haven't seen for half a year or a year. And then it's like, oh yeah, but Bitcoin is really speculative. Like, oh, how can I trust Bitcoin that when I transfer it? And then like, oh, what about the environmental thing? Like that's true, right? They use way too much energy. Like I hear all those things and I'm like, oh, you have an opinion on Bitcoin, but you haven't studied it all. Interesting. So you have no clue, but an opinion on that, which kind of scares me.
I have a theory on that, or an opinion which might kind of rub some people the wrong way, but I don't honestly believe that every person has the capacity to truly understand and appreciate Bitcoin. I really don't, because just look at the world. I mean, people use phones, computers, microphones, a car, but people don't know how it works. I couldn't tell you how. I mean, I know how an engine works or whatever, but I couldn't build a car, but I still drive one. Most people are going to be using Bitcoin in the future without knowing anything about it. They're going to know it's great. They're going to know it works. They're going to have a Lightning wallet. They're going to save in it. They're going to have Bitcoin savings accounts and all of that stuff. But they're not interested in the stuff under the hood. And I read an article, my friend Brady sent me this from Bitcoin Magazine, about the remnants. I don't know if you've heard about this.
No, I have not.
Very interesting. It basically speaks to, just paraphrasing it, that there's certain people in the world that are the pioneers, the leaders, and you actually only need 5 to 10% of a population to move on a new idea, and then the masses will follow. But the masses are not interested in learning about the environmental narrative. Most people, are not going to spend 100 or 1,000 hours understanding digital scarcity and sitting there reading about the number zero and Bitcoin is time. They just don't have the intellectual curiosity for that. So it's up to us as the people that are very intellectually curious to keep developing it, keep actually perfect. Keep spreading the message, keep making the tech even better, and then the mainstream are never going to be Bitcoiners. I don't think we're going to have a whole world of 8 billion people just screaming about Bitcoin. It's yeah, I mean that's just my opinion.
I also, is that the article, by the way?
It is, exactly.
Google is still really good.
That's awesome.
Even with ChatGPT, like you just type in 2 keywords and you have exactly what you searched for. Even though I never heard about that article before, stuff like that.
Brilliant.
But yeah, it's rarely that I Google these days because I use ChatGPT for everything. But it's an interesting topic because you're totally right. All technology adoption curves have happened because the people feel the group psychology that they have to adopt a certain thing.
Yes.
And they adopt WhatsApp because like the grandma will adopt WhatsApp as soon as they want to see the kids
Yes.
picture of their kids, and they can only send it their way with that.
Yeah.
So you need a specific use case. You need you need that network effect
Yes.
for Bitcoin and technology to really prosper in that regard. And nobody. If you go out on the street and ask people like, oh, how does the TCP/IP protocol work so that it's possible that we send WhatsApp messages? I don't know. Maybe you're lucky and you find like 2 persons out there and they can actually explain it good, but they have to have some technical background. And the same thing is with Bitcoin. Like it's really hard to just go out on the street and find people.
It is, but I think that's okay. As far as Bitcoin is concerned, if you analogize that to the internet or these kind of internet protocols, we're still in the 90s or the early 2000s, and I don't think for the internet to become a success that you would have had to be able to ask every person on the street how the internet works. It just one day it's there and it just makes a lot of sense. And Bitcoin on the surface makes a lot of sense. Then the iceberg is gigantic. But if you're a money manager, you're a CFO, whatever, you just got to look at Bitcoin has a 50-60% ARR. It has a 60 vol. It's a unique diversifier. It's a hedge against this and that. You don't have to read the Bitcoin standard and understand hard money in order to say, okay, I want to buy that ETF because it's outperforming others. That's how I think it's going to end up. We have these remnants, people like you that are sitting here every day, dedicating your life to educating people. And then at the end, the masses will show up, but they're not going to understand the intricacies of it. They're just going to appreciate the beauty of it on the surface.
I partnered up with Coin Vigilante. This is the most beautiful Bitcoin timepiece that I ever saw created by anyone. Look at that beauty. I love it so much. Coin Vigilante made a perfect Bitcoin watch. That's the perfect, subtle, elegant way to go out there and show that you are a Bitcoiner. And that watch brand is Bitcoin only. And Coin Vigilante just dropped a completely new and amazing Genesis edition of their watch collections. You have the date of the first ever mined Bitcoin block in there, and of course also the block height and which epoch we are currently in. I love the level of detail they put in this masterpiece. And make sure to check out those amazing Coin Vigilante timepieces down in the descriptions. I love those watches so much. If you watch or listen to my podcast on a regular basis, I guess you already bought some Bitcoin. And now the most important step is to keep the Bitcoin. Keep them secure in a hardware wallet. My personal recommendation for hardware wallet is the BitBox. It's super secure. It's simple to set up. It's also a perfect gift for a friend who has still their Bitcoin on an exchange. And you can get a 5% discount with the code Robin at the checkout. Visit bitbox.swiss/Robin to get your BitBox. And the next step is to really level up your sovereignty as an individual. You have to have have the most secure self-custody setup. You have to secure your own devices. You have to protect your privacy. You have to set up an inheritance plan. And depending on where you live, you even want to have a plan B, a citizenship where you can move in case something goes really, really wrong. And through all those steps, the Bitcoin way is guiding you through step by step. And if you visit thebitcoinway.com/partners/Robin, you even get a 30-minute free call to find out how you can level up your sovereignty. Yeah, absolutely. I also think so. And it's also interesting how this group psychology works, because most people adopt something because they hear it from a neighbor or friend or something like that. Like, oh, like what you're also on WhatsApp? Like,
Yeah.
oh, I should. Oh, okay? I should also get it. and then you're like, the same thing with Bitcoin. You're in a kind of in a discussion, and you're like, oh yeah, like I have that problem with inflation is really bad, and the banks, like they cut me off, and they're like, oh, why don't you use Bitcoin? I was like,
Yes.
what is Bitcoin? And then you come into this thing. I think we're some days away from that event happening.
Yeah.
But I think it's not that far, what most people think. I think it could go faster than most people out there that think that mass adoption event. Do you also think that there could be like one event similar to the .com bubble or similar to this S-curve adoption innovations, where we all of a sudden have a year where just the adoption goes through the roof?
It's a very good question. I honestly don't know. I really honestly don't know the answer to that question. I think if I could take it in a little bit of a different direction, this is something I spend a lot of time thinking about for the business adoption, because as human beings on an individual level, we're competitive. Like when I started investing in Bitcoin, people didn't care. Now, a couple of years later, they look and they're like, oh, okay, so that's what happened to your portfolio. Let's talk about this again, right? But people don't care that much. As a business, it's extremely hard to be in business. It's extremely competitive, and it's a cutthroat world. If one business starts just suddenly doing extremely well, other businesses will notice. Other business owners and CFOs and treasurers will notice, because their life depends on it. There's a different stake, a level of stakes, I think you can say, and they have a lot more skin in the game. So my hope is that whereas us as individuals, we're preoccupied with all these other things and we don't really care that much about Bitcoin, once businesses start, like MetaPlanet adopts Bitcoin for their corporate treasury, and now they're the best performing stock in Japan. Like, that has got to get people to notice that. There must be other Japanese companies sitting thinking, we got to do something. And then another one and another one. And that's where I think really a snowball effect happens. And just a couple of weeks ago, we saw the application for a new ETF that would track companies on a Bitcoin standard. And strangely enough, or profoundly enough, they're weighting these not based on their market cap, but on how much Bitcoin they have. And you have to have 1,000 Bitcoin in your treasury in order to be in this list. In my opinion, I think that ETF is going to just crush everything else. Because, man, you have just a group of only companies that hold Bitcoin. People are going to start looking at that, and they're going to be at their shareholder meetings. They're going to sit at the board. They're going to say, what are we doing? These guys are suddenly growing their balance sheet 40, 50, 60, 100% a year, and we're holding money market funds and short-term treasury bills that yield 4 or 5%. There's another level of competition when it comes to corporations, I think.
That's a really interesting one. I like that. Like the bundling all the Bitcoin companies together that have a treasury over 1,000 Bitcoins and weighing them on how many Bitcoin they have is, why did I never heard that before? Like, that's amazing.
It's so fascinating. I wish I knew the name of it. I cannot remember. Let me see if I can find it. Because it was one of those things where once a Bitwise, let's see what it's called, the Bitwise Bitcoin Standard ETF is one. When I read that, I was writing something about it for a newsletter, and I was just like, why did I not think about that? Like this is such a no-brainer. Every company objectively that adopts Bitcoin outperforms their peers. When you then bundle them all together, what do you think's going to happen? It's so fascinating. I love that.
I love that. I think I found it. It's probably that one, right? The Bitwise Bitcoin Standard Corporation's ETF.
That's exactly what it is.
Wow, I love that. Yeah, I mean it's up for approval now, but you can already see it up. It's like really recently, like end of the last year, they came. Bitwise files for ETF tracking firms with big Bitcoin treasuries. Bitwise has with 1,000 Bitcoin on the balance sheet. That would be such an amazing. Wow.
I mean,
wow.
And I think that's just the beginning, because then somebody's going to create one for companies with 100 Bitcoin, then 10 Bitcoin with smaller caps, and the investment world is so cutthroat. When people are looking at their freaking Bloomberg terminals or whatever, they're going to see these ETFs or these financial products with Bitcoin, and their performance is undeniable. Then they're going to have to go through the whole thing of understanding Bitcoin, but the numbers don't lie. I mean, I think this is just the beginning for this kind of thing.
I love that also, for example, here, there's would be Tesla, of course, and MicroStrategy in there, but Tesla obviously has a way bigger market cap than MicroStrategy, but MicroStrategy would be way bigger just because MicroStrategy has...
That's ridiculous.
That's just unfair.
That is unbelievable, actually.
PTC?
Yeah.
Oh, gosh. And Tesla owns 9,000. I mean, 9,000 is also a hell of a lot of Bitcoin, but for such a big company than Tesla, that's almost nothing. So obviously, MicroStrategy would be way bigger holding in that ETF than Tesla would be. That's insane. I love that. And it capped at a maximum weight at 25%. Also a good thing. So MicroStrategy is not all there is.
Right.
I love that ETF. I think that's the first ETF. I'm like, if I buy one, that's probably the one I buy. Yeah.
Honestly, I feel exactly the same way. Like, that is just such a no-brainer. I think obviously MicroStrategy is getting a lot of love and attention, and it's very well earned, because they are doing this arbitrage between the old system and the new system, and it's just so clearly obvious how powerful that is. I think the only thing that's going to be interesting in the next couple of years for businesses when it comes to treasuries and investments is going to be Bitcoin, because it is just such a powerful thing. And if you kind of want to go more into that, the business case for Bitcoin, that we can talk about that, or we can take it in a different direction.
I would love that. What is for you the business case for Bitcoin?
Yeah, that's one of the things that I spend the most time thinking about. It's just such a fascinating thing, because once you really understand inflation, you have to rethink the way you think about treasuries and you store money and value. If you use CPI as the measure to beat that, it's a false synthetic metric. We got to look at the actual expansion of the money supply is around 7% a year historically, and that means you're getting diluted 7% every year. And even now in a high interest rate environment, you might be getting 4 or 5% on bonds or money market funds. You're still not catching up. And if you hold cash, it's extremely dilutive to shareholder value. I mean, the S&P 500 has been going up like 15%. So in some ways, like Saylor says, that could be seen as the hurdle rate. But as an operating company, you cannot invest all of your treasury in securities. So let's look at some commodity. Gold is not keeping up with the hurdle rate or the S&P 500 in any stretch of the imagination. I mean, you can buy wood or any other commodity. It's not gonna, that doesn't make any sense. Real estate and I think Bitcoiners have a great appreciation for why real estate is not always the best investment. Let's not even go into that whole spiel, but once you go through all of the options that you have to store value in your business, you realize there really isn't any good options. And what that resulted in is that a lot of businesses, and especially larger corporations and publicly traded companies, have decapitalized their companies. They buy back their own stock. They give back the cash in dividends to their shareholders, or they're just sitting on, like Apple and Berkshire Hathaway, sitting on hundreds of billions of dollars. And if you then look at a 7% true inflation in your purchasing power, and you hold 300 billion of cash, that's what, $21 billion in purchasing power you're losing every year. It's insane. Bitcoin is a commodity because you can put your entire treasury in it, and it has the best performance. It's the best performing asset in the world, and it's perfect liquidity. It is trading 24/7, 365 days a year. And every company that adopts Bitcoin, it's not just that their stock immediately goes up. It's just there's something intangible about the spirit and the energy of that company. Semler Scientific too. Every company that kind of jumps on this, suddenly their focus switches from the P&L to the balance sheet, because the balance sheet is really, at this point right now, it's inconsequential for investors. They're looking at the P&L, what's the revenue, what's the forecasted revenue, okay, let's think about it this way. Anything the corporation could hold on its balance sheet is inferior to what an investor might get elsewhere. Because you could just put your money in the S&P 500, get 15% more or less risk-free. So if somebody wants to invest in the business and the business just holds a bunch of gold, that's not very attractive. But when you then really truly understand Bitcoin and you adopt it, you realize that Bitcoin has now become a lever for equity growth through the balance sheet, which is very revolutionary. It used to be a much bigger part back earlier, 20, 30, 40 years ago. Now you actually have a perfect commodity that you could put on your balance sheet that's going to lift your business up. And what I'm very interested in is not just companies putting 1%, 10% of their money in Bitcoin. It's the companies that realize that Bitcoin per share is the metric, that the real game we're all playing right now, whether some people know it, Michael Saylor knows it very well, is how much digital capital can you accumulate? How big of a share of the 21 million coins can you capture now for yourself? And your P&L, your operating side of the business, is really just an excuse or a way for you to accumulate Bitcoin, and then whatever smart and responsible leverage strategies you can use, even better, because you have a very brief period of time right now where you can arbitrage between the old system. You can issue convertible notes and you can take out debt at 0, 1, 2, 3% and then buy an asset that goes up 60%. That's not going to last forever. And I'm very fascinated by these companies that realize this. And very, very quickly you see the only thing they tweet is, we've now done an even harder Bitcoin strategy. We've accumulated more Bitcoin. Now we're raising capital. Now we're issuing more stock. Now we're issuing convertible notes. And these are the companies that are the most fastest growing and the most valuable companies in the world right now.
What is, for people who don't know about it, what is Bitcoin per share? How is that metric coming together?
I should definitely have explained that. the Bitcoin per share is just looking at how much Bitcoin do you actually hold in terms of your shares. So normally when, let's say you raise capital, and you raise equity to get capital, it's dilutive because there will be more shares in existence. And so any shareholder will now hold a smaller amount of the total supply. They still have the same amount nominally of the shares, but they have a smaller share of the pie. It might be accretive if the capital raise is used for something that grows faster than the dilution, but that is not always the case. With Bitcoin, since it has such a high performance, when you raise capital to buy Bitcoin, if you use it to buy Bitcoin and you get more Bitcoin per share, then it's actually accretive to the shareholders because you now own your existing stock now holds more Bitcoin. And that's where also I believe if I understand it correctly, that's Michael's opinion on the Bitcoin yield. How can we use clever strategies in order to give our shareholders more Bitcoin without, for the same amount of shares?
I love that. It's really interesting how and really smart people come together and try to figure out how to integrate Bitcoin in everything.
Yes.
Like where can we fit Bitcoin in there? Really
Yes.
interesting. I love that. How do you now see when you have that side on the Bitcoin and the corporation side of things? How do you see the same thing happening for nation states as they are also kind of corporations?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, completely above my pay grade. But my opinion is the value proposition again is the same for a nation state, only that it's even more perilous because let's look at if the U.S. was a corporation, it would be absolutely effed. Let's say it like that. So the only option I think that modern nation states like the ones in Europe and the European Union and the US and Japan, every modern nation state is indebted. It's ridiculous with over 100% debt to GDP and whatnot. When you adopt Bitcoin, you suddenly have a solid foundation to stand on, and you might actually be able to have investment gains from Bitcoin that outpace the debt that you have or the interest that you have to pay on the debt. So the same game theory is going to play out, but it might actually be even more aggressive. I don't know what you think, but it's the same with the business where people, we don't really care. Okay, you got rich on Bitcoin, whatever. A business like my competitors doing what? They just tripled their business in a year. Well, when a nation state starts adopting Bitcoin, that's probably going to be the ultimate FOMO. I'd love to hear your opinion on that, actually.
Yeah, it's nation. I think we will see a lot of things in 2025, and I think we're all not ready for it. If because Trump is extremely competitive, BRICS already talked about using a hard asset. And they're considering Bitcoin. They know that gold is not working out. They know that, and then the only option is Bitcoin. Russia admitted that they are already using Bitcoin. The finance minister made some comments for settling trade, and then Trump is extremely competitive and wants to win. He wants to be the first one. He wants that America does all the innovation. Yes. Where you see a lot of different angles from that, but it all leads to I loved how it actually will be released today where we speak the podcast with I think Joe Consorti, I think it is.
Nice.
Where we talked about exactly that, and he phrases it so nice. He says there's a Bitcoin Cold War going on, and we are just waiting. Who's the first nation to press the button and buy as much Bitcoin as they can. And as soon as one of those countries is really trying to we want all the Bitcoin in our nation, we get it now. That's the game over point. That's the major point, because they have literally unlimited resources to do so.
Yes.
MicroStrategy is amazing, but if America tries to buy Bitcoin, that's like a little bit of a bigger force.
I think that is the end game. I think once the nation state game theory is on, I don't think you could ever go back to Bitcoin being this kind of niche retail thing or having the same kind of cycles. I think it's going to completely change the game. And I hope we've accumulated enough before then because I think it would be just absolutely insane. And while MicroStrategy has to do clever financial engineering in order to print money to buy Bitcoin. Basically, a government could just press a button and they could push it to $1 million in a day if they wanted to. It's yeah, very, very interesting. And I think Joe is probably a lot more competent to talk about this than me. I'll look forward to that episode. He's such a great voice in this space, I think.
Absolutely. I met him in Abu Dhabi and I was like just impressed. And I was like, hey, you have to come on my show.
That's awesome.
How is it actually looking in your country, in Denmark, or maybe overall in Europe? What do you see for the Bitcoin community there?
I don't think I'm the right person to ask about that. I don't care too much for Denmark in terms of finances, to be honest. And the way they're treating Bitcoin is despicable. I mean, they're just talking about doing a lagerbeskatning. What's it called? A tax on capital gains. What is that called? Where they're actually going to tax you before you even have an unrealized capital gains tax. Excuse me. That's just the kind of nonsense we're getting over here, and I'm just not interested in it. So I think the U.S. is going to lead this. My company Sovereign, we're focused on the US market. I think that's where the true innovation is going to happen. I think Europe, we're just fighting too much. We're leading in regulation, but not a lot is happening, I think.
Yeah, it's unfortunate, and I really like living in Europe. I think it's a great place to live and enjoy life, and but I don't think it's the best place to build a company. I don't know if it's the best place here to do that. I'm doing it currently, so let's see how it works out. I have a lot of hope for Austria and Europe, but again, I'm an optimist. Maybe I'm naive. Let's see how it actually shakes up. I actually watch, because of that, now very closely what governments and policies are doing. So I don't care about politicians, but I care of the policies they're actually doing. So I don't listen to any drama going on in politics. I like to focus like, okay, what are they proposing and what is actually getting coming into law and what is actually happening for policy change, because there's always policy change in politics. And I try to filter out, okay, what is important for me. I don't care if they do some public transport. There is some improve, like, as long as public transport works somehow, it's fine for me. Don't bother me with that news. What are you doing for taxes? What are you doing to bring more innovation, more corporations, more companies in our country? That's at the end of the day where it all falls apart, or where it all prospers. If a country is successful with bringing really good talent to Austria and bringing really great companies to Austria, then they will succeed. If they don't succeed with that, they will fail in all the other things also. So that's where I'm like trying to focus on with seeing politics with the policies they are doing.
I think politics is just a clown show to a big part, and it's important you pay attention. It's important you fight for things, but I think Jeff Booth says it well. You gotta help the new system instead of fighting the old. And I think Europe is a perfect example of the kind of empire that's going to crumble under its own weight. Eventually, civilization will literally the weight of its laws and regulations will crush the citizens. When I was starting the firm, I was researching actually doing it in Germany and got very dissuaded because people said that as an entrepreneur, the amount of time you had to spend jumping through bureaucratic loopholes and all the red tape and the fees and the taxes, that they actually, a lot of them went back and remade their companies in Cyprus and Malta and all these other places. You see the same thing in the UK. All the millionaires are leaving. The same thing in Norway. There's a story about this Bitcoiner who, or maybe he was a crypto guy, but he got taxed an unrealized capital gains tax in Norway with money he didn't have. And he had equity value, but that's not cash. And so he was completely screwed. This is something that happens late stage in a civilization, I think, where the government becomes so power hungry and so socialistic that they start just taking more and more and more. And as Bitcoin rises and the fiat system gets more and more dilapidated, they're going to have to get even more aggressive. And I try to just not pay too much attention to it because I think it's so sad to watch, honestly.
I totally agree with that. I watch the policies just because I want to see if I'm in the right country. Right now, it's fine for me, and I see actually some developments in the right direction. That's why I'm kind of hopeful.
Nice.
But if we are going the wrong direction, like bye bye.
Yeah,
I'm going. But yeah, which brings us to one interesting point that I want to get to. It fits really nicely. What do you see Bitcoin playing the role for entrepreneurs and startups? For non-Bitcoin startups and non-Bitcoin entrepreneurs, obviously. Is that also in the early stages of a startup, early stages of entrepreneurs? Is that also something that you already should consider? Do you see something there? Or is it more later when you have already some cash balances?
wow, that's such a good question. I maybe wish I had a better answer, but let me try it because I think it's there's a great irony with Bitcoin, and we're kind of experiencing the same thing in my company where we're looking to raise some money, find some investors, but it's I think it's comical. Anyone that truly understands Bitcoin understands that it is the best performing asset, it's the best investment, and it's like Michael looks at it as a 50-60% risk-free rate, or I think maybe the 29% from his 21 models. So I think that's what he uses. So if someone is pitching you an idea and they cannot give you a 29% risk-free rate, well, so the only, and for Bitcoin companies, it's especially difficult because anyone that wants to invest in a Bitcoin company needs to understand Bitcoin. But if they understand Bitcoin, then they also understand the opportunity cost of putting their money with your firm instead of just in Bitcoin itself. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And I think that's a unique window where we are currently, because you're totally once everyone adopted Bitcoin will not gain 30% in purchasing power every year. And then it will normalize, and then you will have a greater incentive again to invest in other things.
Yes.
But right now, if you're a Bitcoiner, you have to have a lot of Bitcoin and a lot of knowledge in the investment space to know, okay, I have Bitcoin, but I also have that portion of my financial energy that I put towards a company.
Yes.
And that company has to create massive returns, because otherwise the additional risk that a company brings, because company and startups, they can fail, they mostly actually fail. So the risk is really high on there. So you don't want to invest something that then just like loses its value to 100%. Then it's way better to just keep it in Bitcoin. And that additional risk has to have so much additional cash flow compared to when you have a fiat investor who thinks in fiat terms, and they're like, oh, my cash is losing so much value. I just invest in all the startups that I can. So there's a whole different aspect to that.
And since credit is so cheap, that's what is part of what over levers the economy, because venture capitalists and any other kind of investors in a fiat world, access to debt is extremely easy, especially if you already have money. If you have tens of millions of dollars, and especially going back before they raised interest rates, you could just go out and loan $10 million for 2% interest, and then, oh, here's money for this and that. In a Bitcoin world, that picture changes because we have to act with much more austerity and forward thinking and building on a solid foundation. I think a lot of Bitcoiners have talked about this. We'll go back to more focus on equity and not on debt. Because if capital is truly scarce, if it's Bitcoin, then you must be much more prudent with how you deploy that capital, because there's not just endless amounts of free money from a spigot somewhere.
Yeah, for totally.
I think one other thing I want to say to that is I read a very interesting story on Twitter just the other day where a company had raised money and they put it in Bitcoin. I think that must have been last year or at the bottom of the bear market. Don't hold me to that, but they put the raised capital in Bitcoin, and now they have a 10-year runway because Bitcoin basically doubled since then. That's a very, very interesting way, going back to your question, of kind of bootstrapping a company. Because what if you gave a nascent, obviously depends on where you are in the cycle and all that, but if you gave a nascent entrepreneur or company 10 million sats, 50 million sats, 1 Bitcoin, 10 Bitcoin, and then had that as like the golden egg, like the nest egg, and it was pure digital economic energy that could then sustain them, that's a very interesting scenario. But honestly, I wish I had thought more about that because it's very fascinating.
You can look back at my Seyr interview actually, because I think even the title, if I'm correct, was Bitcoin Makes You Immortal.
Wow, right.
And he talked about that concept of, if you have a business and you want to make it immortal, and if you want to make it living long, Bitcoin is the only chance. Everything else is going to zero eventually. Everything else will die off. But Bitcoin is that one asset that you can put in there and makes your company live forever.
Yes.
It makes you immortal. And that's kind of probably more for cash rich companies right now. I don't know if that a small startup can also do that. They probably need like more cash power for that. But as you make that example, it's if you put those Bitcoin in there, and you can the startup has more life because of that.
Yes.
It has also more chance to grow organically, and it kind of takes that that pressure away, like, oh, like we have to make it to the next quarter to make the next investment round and to do this. Like, I think that's not healthy to live from like quarter to quarter or from half year to half year and always fight with more presentations to like more investment money. A CEO should do the best to make the best product and services and to bring it to as many people as possible, and not always run around investments like, oh, like, can we have more money here? Can we more money here? The investors should like love to come and like they should, like, it should be a different story.
I mean, I was just sitting when you're saying that's brilliant, just thinking of a scenario in my mind. Let's say you raised $1 million for a startup, and instead of just leaving that $1 million in the bank or putting it in a sweep account or whatever to earn a little bit of interest, you took, obviously you have to be very smart about it and run the numbers, but let's say you just took 500,000 of it and you put it in Bitcoin and you bought, 5 Bitcoin. You made sure the rest is for operating expenses. You have liquidity for 4 quarters or whatever. I don't even know the numbers, what that would be, but you're not going to need that Bitcoin tomorrow or the next 6-12 months. What happens if Bitcoin starts going up and suddenly you might not even have turned a profit yet? You might not even have a product or generating revenue, but you're already seeing investment gains in your Bitcoin treasury. I don't know when that has ever happened before. I mean, because what could you have invested in? What could you have put that treasury in besides Bitcoin that would have yielded that result? I don't know what that, but gold is not gonna do that. So I don't know. I mean, it's incomparable.
Absolutely, it's the one thing that, as coming back to the beginning of the podcast, every institution's family business person, whatever swimming club needs to gain with their financial power. I think that's the bottom line. I think that's beautiful, and that's kind of a full circle back to the beginning of the podcast. I love that. I have one question for each and one of my guests, and the question is, what can we learn from you besides Bitcoin?
Oh wow. I guess what I was always very, very fascinated about in my adult life is just generally how the world works, and just looking at history and the psychology of humans, and all of that eventually all led to Bitcoin. And I don't know if I could teach anyone anything about that, but I think once you get into Bitcoin, all of these different areas have to make sense. And if you already are a person that have studied different things, you're eclectic or have different passions, you're much more able to grok Bitcoin. And yeah, I don't know if that was a good answer or not. I hadn't really thought about that.
I love that. Yeah, really cool. Perfect. We have an end routine in the podcast where the previous guest is asking a question for the next guest before, without knowing who the next guest actually is. And the question from a previous guest is, if you had one last orange pill available, who would you give it to?
Man, that's a good question, actually. I think, honestly, I'm going to regret this, but I'm actually going to say Elon Musk. I there's something about Elon, I just can't shake it. I think he's trolling us with Bitcoin, because there's no way you can be that intelligent and just still fudding Bitcoin and not really getting it. But if that guy put 1/10 of the energy that he puts into shit posting on Twitter, excuse me, and championing all his other causes, we would have hyper Bitcoinization tomorrow. I think so.
And I think he actually is a Bitcoiner. I think he's trolling, and I think you cannot hold. He holds still on the company balance sheet 10,000 Bitcoin. It's known that he holds 10x more Bitcoin than Dogecoin personally. He said that on multiple occasions, and he is overall a Bitcoiner. Like I really think that it's just like, watch what he does and not what he speaks. He speaks about Dogecoin. He speaks about weird things. And obviously he doesn't help the Bitcoin crowd a lot.
No,
but I think he himself, he gets what Bitcoin represents, at least to a certain extent, that Tesla still holds Bitcoin. I think SpaceX still holds Bitcoin. It's not publicly available, so we don't really know. And for all we know, he probably has more Bitcoin than most people listening here.
Oh, 100%. I just think he could be doing so much more. I know he's not obligated to do so. I mean, Tesla, they said, well, we're not going to be buying more Bitcoin until it's 50% of the mining is coming from renewable energies. Well, that happened years ago, and they still haven't changed anything. Then he's on an X Space, and Preston Pish asks him a question about Bitcoin. He's like, oh, I don't want to talk about Bitcoin, blah, blah, blah. And this is like, and then he fuels the fire of the crypto foolery by stoking that fire and pouring gasoline on it, taking thousands of millions of young people that could be spending their time reading the Bitcoin Standard, and now they're gambling on monkey pictures. So I think he's doing a big disservice to people. I think if he really came out and said, Bitcoin is one of the most important things in the world, a lot of people would think about that, because he's admired by a lot of people.
And he also benefits a lot from the fiat system, and he's also not in a state of pain because of the fiat system. So he has no real incentive to figure it out, and he has a lot of other things to think about. I love him because he's giving Twitter a new life, and giving Twitter being more freedom of speech orientated. I think he's the reason why Mark Zuckerberg is now also thinking about making Facebook and Instagram and WhatsApp a little bit more freer and freedom of speech orientated. This will ultimately impact all of the other platforms also. I think he does a really great job for humanity, and he's a really important person. But it's kind of hard to see that he doesn't get Bitcoin to the extent that he helps it publicly. But yeah, maybe he's just like a Bitcoin maxi and trolls the world, and he's just having fun.
I swear to God, there's something we're not getting, because I used to respect Elon a lot. I read his autobiography like over 10 years ago, and the way he speaks back then, he's like, I want to do as much good for humanity as possible. So he's like, I want to get us to space. I want to get renewable energies. I want us to have electric cars. And he goes out and does all that. But then when it comes to the most important thing for humanity, which kind of fits perfectly into his energy background, he just continually skirts around it. So there's something we don't understand. I think he's holding his cards close to the chest.
Absolutely, really cool. Let's come before I let you go. Where can people find you, ask you questions, and reach out to you?
Well, I am on Twitter and on LinkedIn as well, Daniel Frank. I think they'll probably get more out of if people are interested in the intersection of Bitcoin and business, they should follow our company, Sovereign, the Bitcoin consulting company. We post a lot of things about that. That's probably because I don't think I have that much interesting to say on there. But if people are interested in Bitcoin and business, they can go follow us there.
Really cool. Perfect. And thank you so much for taking the time. Daniel, also thank you so much for everyone that is watching and listening, for joining us today. As always, I'll be back tomorrow with another episode. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.